Thank you all for coming for this next talk in the Using Docker for Developers track. This is going to be about app in a box with Michael Irvin. He's a Docker captain. He works for Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, if I get the official name right, at Blacksburg in the US. And he's a Docker captain. He's been working with the applications packaging team at Docker, and I think he has a lot of good insights into that space and will be convincing all of us to be using it. So without much ado, I'll hand over to Mike.
Thank you. All right. How's everybody this I guess, afternoon now? Doing all right? Slow response? All right. That's the crowd I get. All right, well, we'll take this. So again, thanks for the opportunity to speak, and thank you for coming today. We've got some really cool stuff that we've been working on, and excited to be on stage to show it off to you. So I'm going to start off by giving a warning that there's lots of content ahead. I know a lot of you are still fairly new to Docker App. We saw some demos of it in the keynote this morning. But we're using Docker App for quite a few different pieces. We've even built another tool on top of Docker App. So that just FYI, there's going to be a decent amount of content. So if you don't get it all fully during this session, I'm sorry, but that's how it is. But we'll work with it from there. So just quick information about Virginia Tech. So Virginia Tech is a university. It was founded back in 1872. It's in Blacksburg, Virginia. It's a really small town. You drive down the interstate. You've got Mountain, Calfield. Huge university, Calfield, Mountain. It's really out in the middle of nowhere. Our main campus is in Blacksburg, Virginia, but we've got campuses all over the state of Virginia. Just a couple weeks ago, there was a new innovation campus announced up in the Arlington area, which was a big draw for Amazon HQ2 to go into that area. So we're super excited about the potential that's coming pretty soon. We've also got a campus here in Switzerland, in Riva San Vitale. We've got about 35,000 students and then another 4,500 faculty and staff. So it's a pretty big university. We do a lot of different things. We do a lot of research, as mentioned here, over $500 million research portfolio. And yeah, there's a lot going on. But that's not why I'm here to talk to you. So at the university, I'm in a central IT team that's building software to help do research administrative systems. And I won't bore you with the details, but let's just imagine it's document management, collaboration, compliance, basically making sure all the T's are crossed, all the I's are dotted, that we're doing what's allowed, but then also making sure we're within federal laws and local laws and that kind of stuff. Again, I won't bore you with the details. But when we started this project, we were basically told you have greenfield, figure out whatever practices, policies, et cetera, that you want to use and go for it. Don't worry about the way that we've always done things. So we started playing with containers, and we've been using containers for about 4 years now. And we're the first application to be deployed to the public cloud. We're using AWS and to work in containers. So it's been a fun project, and this is a source of a lot of the really cool things that we're doing. Now, one of the important pieces, this last bullet point, is the system is composed of several different components. And I don't mean microservices. We still have a monolithic API. We'll see it here in a minute. But we have several different components. We have the API, but then we have lots of separately deployed front-end clients for different purposes. And again, I'll go into that here in a minute. One important thing is that our team uses GitHub Flow. I think most of you are probably quite familiar with it. But just in case you're not, the way GitHub Flow works is that the master branch is always production quality code. So at any point in time, you should be able to deploy the master branch. So if you want to do new feature work or bug fixes or whatever the case, you need to make a new branch. All the new work gets done on that branch. It gets accepted by in our case, the QA team. They validate that we met the feature, we fixed the bug, et cetera. Then a merge request gets opened. We do code review, et cetera, from there. And then at some point, it gets merged into master and it's ready for release. We're not a team that's deploying every time master gets deployed, so we're not that far advanced. But we're deploying about every 2 weeks, which for many of the campuses or many of the applications on campus is far more regular than what we're used to. So with simple apps, and by simple I mean a single service application, meaning all the source code that we're working on is in a single repository. It's fairly easy to start working on a new feature branch. For example, if I had a single repo app and I want to start working on feature X, I would just make a branch for feature X. I would make all my code updates on that feature branch and go from there. And switching between branches, between features being worked on is as simple as, well, check out the other branch. And I may have to restart containers, but that's about it. It's not too complicated. But like I mentioned earlier, Summit is not one of these types of applications. We have lots of different components. We have a desktop client, which is basically just a web client, but it's a pretty full-fledged. It has all the features set. We've got a mobile client. We took very few features and made a specific mobile client for it. And we've got static user docs. We have an admin client to provide some of the administrative details. But at the end of the day, they're all hitting a monolithic API. Again, not microservice or anything like that. It works for our team. Great. We'll continue using it. But what we often run into are one or two different types of scenarios. One, I'm going to work on a feature or a bug fix that only affects one component. So in this case, I'm going to work on the desktop client. For example, there was a bug. I'm going to make a feature request, or a feature branch, sorry. And in this case, the branch is named crest1111, and that's the Jira ticket issue. I'll do my work on that. Great, no big deal. Shouldn't be too hard. And I'm going to use the master branch for all the other components. I just want the latest API, latest everything else. But then we also have the other scenario in which, well, some of the work needs updates in multiple components. So for example, I'm going to make an API change. In order for that API change to be successful, I probably need to coordinate it with my other clients. So I may want to make sure that my desktop client gets updated, the mobile client, et cetera. Again, we don't have a lot of the fancy API versioning and all that kind of stuff, so we basically coordinate it this way. With multiple services now, switching between feature branches is a little more difficult. So for example, if I am the desktop client developer and I'm working on this exact scenario, well, I need to make sure that I've got the right API to hit against. Okay? So simply checking it out it's not quite as simple because I need to make sure I have the right version of the API that I'm pointing against. The environment is now scattered across several repositories. So what's often happened is that we run into a situation like this. We've got a developer that's working on a client, for example, crest1234 in these cases, but they're pointing against the wrong version of the API. They forgot to check out that one or spin up the right images, et cetera. So again, coordinating all these different pieces has proven difficult. Our objective is we want, and we coined this phrase internally, we want an app in a box. We want the ability to say, I want to spin up all of Summit, all of our application, just out of a box. Okay? And we want this app in a box to be updated automatically over time. Meaning that if I create a new feature branch and I push an update to the desktop client, that the app in the box somehow knows that that's the right version to use for that version of the app in a box. Okay? And so this is our objective, this was our goal, and how can we do this? Now for this presentation, I'm not going to use Summit because it takes too long to build and everything too, so I'm going to use a smaller, simpler app. And so I just made a really simple to-do list application because that's another one that everybody does for demos. I have a hello world message that's provided by the API. It's just what's the hello greeting. And then I can write to-do list items. In this case, be awesome, don't mess up the talk, which hopefully those help me out here. Our app infrastructure here, we've got the client itself is just a really simple React client. The API that's going to support the backend service is just a Node API, and it's going to persist in Mongo. Nothing fancy here. And we're going to throw a reverse proxy in front, so that way I don't have to figure out port mapping differences and that kind of stuff. And another reason that I use the reverse proxy is because this is how we're going to deploy it in production. Or this is how we would if we were actually deploying this to-do list. I'm not going to say, well, my API is on port 8431 or some crazy numbers. I'm using hostname differences, so I should also reflect that same infrastructure locally. We're huge fans of Traffic. Anybody use Traffic? Anybody heard of it? Okay, there's a couple hands. We're huge fans of it. You just add labels to your containers, and it does all the configuring. We'll see some examples of it here in a minute. Okay. So the feature that we're going to work on for this talk is we're just going to theme the app for DockerCon. It was kind of this ugly gray and whatnot, and so we're going to change the hello world message, And we're also going to apply a style sheet to the theme to make it just look a little bit better. Now, I'm partnering with a team member that we're just going to call Sally in this case. And she's going to do the API work, and she's trying to do the CSS work, trying to do this whole feature. And we'll see how she's doing in just a second. So let's go ahead and check in with Sally here. So how's the work going? Let's see how good the Wi-Fi is working here. Oh, great. Okay, make that a little bit bigger for you. Okay, so Sally ran into an issue. Well, this is great for my demo, right? Do I have a minute to help? Well, I'm really in the middle of a presentation, so I probably shouldn't commit, but let's see what we can do. Sure, what's up? So having trouble with CSS. Okay, imagine that. Wait, what is she sending me now? Yeah, how many people have felt this frustration before? Okay, okay, I should have asked how many haven't. I think we all run into this as well. Okay. Okay. So sure, we'll go ahead and do it. Okay, great. So she's already made a branch. So there's already a feature branch for this. Cool. So theoretically, we should be able to take her API and continue working from there. Okay. Okay, thanks for reminding me. Don't forget to use Docker app this time. I was one of those that were guilty of using the wrong versions of the API last time. And, oh, cool. She even sent me the command to use. Okay, so let's actually run this and see what happens. All right, let's jump to my client here. And, okay, so this morning we saw some demos of Docker app. In this particular demo, or this particular command here, I'm using Docker app render, which wasn't talked about too much. But Docker app render, what it's going to do is it's going to pull the Docker app, and it's going to apply the settings, whatever they may be, and then render the output to the command line as such. And what you may have noticed is I added a setting that says enable desktop equals false. I'll explain what this is in a second, but if I look in the services, I don't see that being applied. Okay, cool. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. So let me just pipe that to Docker Compose now. I'll spin this up. And so I'm using app in a box now to spin up the rest of my environment. But let's go ahead and spin up another container here. Let's see if she made a branch for the, nope, so no branch yet, so let's go ahead and make a branch. And I'm going to go ahead and just spin up another Docker Compose, but this one is in my component repository that's going to spin up a container that's basically ready for dev code or development. So if I run my logs now, we see React starting up, and we'll give that a second to go. While it's doing that, I'm going to go ahead and go into my source, and I'm just going to go into my app CSS. And wait for the development server to finish starting. All right, we'll just let this go. Okay. So I'm going to apply some CSS to do some DockerCon theming, which is really just going to change the colors. And thanks. All right, well, we'll give that a second. So what I'll do is what I'm doing here is I've used the app in a box. I'll go back to my slides while that's running here. I'm using the app in a box, and I spun up using the app in a box. So using Docker app, I'm spinning up Mongo, I'm spinning up Node, and I spun up my proxy. But I disabled the desktop client because I want to run a dev version of that particular component. And so I spun up everything else with Docker app, and now I'm going to go into Docker Compose for that just local component, or sorry, that component, and spin up the dev enable container. It's going to hook into all the same networks and everything else. Let's try it again. course, my fans are spinning up here. Okay. Yay, nothing like demos. Okay. So let's just kill that guy. All right, we'll see if it works this time. If not, we'll just keep going on. I swear this worked just a couple minutes ago. There we go, hurrah. Okay, so now if I open up my browser, so app.dceu, so that's just going on to my local host here, we should see my crazy ugly theme. Okay, now it's still loading everything. Okay, hello DockerCon, and there's my app. Okay, so yes, I know terribly ugly, but I'm not claiming to be a designer here. Sally asked me to do it. We're just going to do it. So, all right, I'm going to screenshot this real quick. I'll say done. Okay. And well, want me to go ahead and submit the merge request here. Okay, so Sally's recognizing that, sure, it's the right color palette, but that's pretty ugly. So I'm going to go ahead and just commit this and commit added DockerCon theme. Oh, let me grab my, if you don't sign your commits, I encourage you to do so. So I'm going to go ahead and push that. All right, we'll let that run. So again, what I did was use app in a box to set up the local environment that's using the correct versions of each of the components. Okay, so is anybody impressed, hopefully? Okay, hopefully, maybe, all right. Okay, but the secret sauce to all this is Docker Compose is already smart enough to provide an environment. Okay, so before Sally pushed the API, let's just assume that this is what the compose file looked like. It had the right versions of the image, the images for the API, the desktop client, the docs, the mobile client, et cetera. And then what happened is when she pushed to the API, the image specification for the compose file for that feature branch was updated. Everything else is still using master. And then somehow, some way, I'm now able to consume that compose file, and I have the latest versions of everything. Okay? So again, like I mentioned earlier, try to construct your compose files, especially if you're using Docker app and you're trying to go this way. Reflect and mirror your environment as much as possible. I talked about how we're using a reverse proxy. Do the same thing. Don't use just crazy ports for everything. Okay? If you're using hostname differences in production, do the same thing locally. Use a reverse proxy that makes that easy. Again, we use Traffic. I encourage you, recommend it, but again, whatever you use, reflect your production environment locally as much as possible. Okay, but so how do we do all this? Okay. The way that we figured this out, we realized we need to have the environment off in its own repository. So each of the components have their own repository, but if we have what we call the Summit env repo, that repo is really just the compose file. Okay? So anytime that an upstream component gets updated, in this case the desktop app, when an update is pushed to it, it builds and pushes its image to a registry, great, and then it notifies the Summit env project. We're using GitLab, so it's just a remote build trigger. And we say build, basically this service was updated and here's the new image, okay? And for this feature branch. The Summit env project then starts a build and then updates the compose file for that feature branch for that service to use the new image. And then from there, what we've done is we just published the Docker app. So this morning's keynote was really talking about using Docker app to make the Docker compose file available to anybody. in their case, ops for the most part. Well, we recognize that we can do the same thing for our local development environment. So great, publish the compose file. Now I can just pull that and use that locally. Going into it just a little bit more, the build pipeline. So when we trigger the build on the Summit ENV project, this is actually kind of what's going on. There's a special branch that we've created just called the update branch. And that's the branch that gets triggered. And this is what it's doing. It's looking to see, hey, do I already know about that feature branch? Great. If not, go ahead and make a branch off of master, update the compose file now, git commit, push it back. Well, when I push back to the repository, that triggers another build for that feature branch now, which then pushes the Docker app. Okay. So again, what is Docker app? I'm not going to go too much into this because, well, we saw it in the keynote this morning. But just a refresh in case you forgot, Docker app is still an experimental utility. It's a tool that was designed to make compose files shareable and reusable. Docker app, it really takes the compose file as well as some settings and metadata, packages it up in an image, and then shares that. At the end of the day, remember that an image is just a portable file system, okay, with some extra metadata. And in this case, they took that concept and say, well, if this is just a portable file system, let's just put the compose file in it, and now we don't have to clone repos. We don't have to figure out some other ways to share the compose file. We'll just use Docker app for it. Once you have your app image and it's shared through a registry, you can use all the same auth constraints that you currently use for your organization. You can use settings, as we saw earlier, for various configuration for changing replicas or ports or whatever else you want to do. And then you can apply those settings when you deploy or when you render, et cetera, like we saw in the demo just a minute ago. You can also use it to generate Helm charts as well. So there's lots of really cool features with Docker app. Be sure to look at the full feature set. Here's a couple of commands. So if I want to start a new Docker app project, I've used Docker app init. I can then push my project to Docker Hub. That'll create the image, push it up to Docker Hub or a local registry. Docker app deploy will pull that image and then deploy it in Swarm or Kubernetes, just depending on what your settings, the default values are there. And Docker app render, like we saw earlier, will take everything, but rather than deploying it, we'll just output the file, or output a compose file to standard out, and then you can do whatever you want from there. So just diving really quickly into an image, just proving that it's not all just smoke and mirrors here. So if I do a Docker image save, I don't know how many of you are familiar with image save, but it allows me to save an image and then I can actually explode it, look at it and everything. I'm going to save the DCEU Docker app theme for DockerCon. And the standard out of that is a tar file, so I'm just going to go ahead and auto extract it. If we look at this, if I look at the manifest JSON, it's an image with a single layer in it. If we go into that layer, TXF, if we look at the contents of that layer, oops, TVF, that's what I want. That's all that's in this image. Again, it's just those 3 files. So it's taking those files, packaging them in an image, and then shipping them out. So, and then Docker app is smart enough to know, okay, this is a Docker app image that you're pulling. I'm going to extract the compose file out and then do a second step to actually do the rendering or do the deploy, whatever. But that's really the secret sauce here. It's just packaging it up in an image and shipping that out the door. Okay. So how's this change local development? Well, we saw some examples of that earlier. Again, I can spin up this app in a box, and I can say, well, I want to do work in the desktop client, so let me disable that, and now let me go back into my component repo, and I'm going to spin up a dev-enabled version, and as long as I use the same network names, it's going to hook into all the same networks. I can use the same proxy. I can basically everything else will still work. Okay? And that's an important piece. Make sure that if you're doing this, you use the same network names for everything. And other than that, it should just work. And that's the beauty of Docker Compose here. Disabling a service, so I hinted at that earlier. With Docker app, actually let me back up a little bit. With Docker Compose 3.4 and beyond, it provided support for extension fields. And extension fields are these X- fields. So again, you can use it for any of your own metadata that you want to use within your organization. But Docker app recognizes a X-enabled field. When that is set to anything falsy, what happens is that service is basically completely ignored. We saw that in the rendered output, in which I set a setting that said, I don't want to enable the desktop client. That set the X enabled to false for that particular service, and it wasn't included in the rendered output. And again, hooking in a dev container, then each of my individual component repos just have their own Docker Compose file. Again, they're tailored to work for the app in a box mode. Great, that's fine. But when I do a Docker Compose up now for each of my repositories, they're going to hook into all the networks and everything else that existed in the that came from app in a box. Since I'm using traffic, that container also just needs to add the labels so that it will receive traffic. So let's actually, I'm going to show that just a little bit here. Actually, let me go to my. So again, if I go to my Docker Compose file, this is within the desktop client. It's doing a client. It's building an image that it's going to use for the build. It's mounting in the source code because it's going to watch for file system changes, build the JavaScript, the CSS, et cetera, like a normal React app would. But I'm hooking into a network that if I look into, let me render the output down here. If we look at the networks that are named down here, it's creating a network called the DCEU proxy. And so again, I'm specifying exact names for each of these networks so I know that they're going to hook together. I have my traffic labels. For those of you that aren't familiar with traffic, I basically just add these labels, say this is the name of my backend. I'm going to name it client. Here's the routing rule. So any request that comes to traffic that has a host name of app.dceu, I want it to go to this container. And when it goes to this container, go to the container's port 3000. And when the container starts up, traffic hears of that container starting. It's just listening to events, and it's going to start sending traffic to it. It's that easy. So that's all it takes. Okay. So what else can we do with this? There's actually quite a few other things that we can do with this. I'm going to show off one of the things here. With Docker App Render, we can take full advantage of all the other Compose features. One of these features is allowing us to use multiple Compose files. Okay. With multiple Compose files, I don't know how many of you have done this before, because I personally didn't do it a lot before this. With multiple Compose files, I can layer services from multiple Compose files. Okay. When I take the Docker App Render, as we saw, it just dumps a Docker Compose file to standard out. So if I save that, then I can use that as another file, and I can layer other things on top of it. And we'll see why I need that. But one of the important things, and I had this as a note, you can't pipe it directly to Docker Compose. So I can't do a Docker App Render, pipe it directly to Docker Compose, and then use another static file. If I'm piping input, you can only use pipe input. You can't use multiple files with pipe input. There's an issue on the Docker Compose GitHub repo, but it hasn't been resolved right now. So we'll see the workaround for that here in a second. But so what can I do with that? Again, here's my app in a box. I've got my proxy. I've got my desktop client. I've got my API, and I've got the database. Great. And again, I get that just by doing Docker App Render, doing the Compose up. So if I took another Compose file that had a Selenium container in it, okay, those of you that aren't familiar with Selenium, Selenium is a test automation framework that can be used to automate browsers. So I can send it instructions to say, type in this input, click on this link, go to this page, et cetera. It allows me to automate the browser, so I can do end-to-end testing. If I launch Selenium, and then I launch another container that has some test code in it, now I can do full end-to-end testing of my application. Again, the idea is take app in a box, use that to say this is the latest master build, and I'm going to layer in this other Compose file that now adds additional containers to do full end-to-end testing. Another feature that I want to highlight out of Docker and Compose that probably not many of you have heard of is exit code from. And this is a flag when using Docker Compose up. What it does is it says, all right, I'm going to spin up the stack, but I'm going to watch a specific service. When that specific service stops, I'm going to tear down the entire stack, and whatever the exit code is from that single container, that will be the exit code for the Docker Compose command. Okay? Now, so why is this important? Well, if if I run this with an exit code for my test code, and if my test code fails, if the exit code is a failure status, and if I have this in a CI build pipeline, then the Docker compose command fails, then my build fails. Okay, so I'll step that through. If my test code fails, Docker compose fails, my build fails. Okay, and that's been really, really powerful for us. So we can have automated CI builds. Every time we push code, trigger the functional test, it'll spin up the latest version of this feature branch, run the functional test against it, and if it fails, our build fails, we're notified immediately through Slack or whatever other means, and we know that we need to go fix it. So let's actually kind of show that off. So I'm going to jump over into IntelliJ because we're big fans also of the Arquillian, Drone, and Graphene frameworks. I don't know how many people are familiar with that. Selenium has tons of frameworks to build on top of, but this particular one it provides good abstractions on top of it. And I've got a test here that's going to basically test everything. It's going to validate that it has the welcome message. It's going to do the home page. It's going to add items and et cetera. Now, in order to do this, is that too small? That's pretty small down there, huh? All right, let me get another terminal here. So like I mentioned earlier, if I do a render of DCEU Docker app, I'll just use the master branch. And if I pipe that to Docker compose, and the -f- says the first file I want to use is from standard out, or sorry, from standard in, which is the standard out from the previous command. And I have a local compose file that's going to spin everything up and actually do the test. Exit code from equals test. Okay. And if I run this, I'm going to get this error. And this is what I was talking about earlier. I can't pipe the render command and use that, but then also use a static file. Okay. And again, that's just a shortcoming for right now. So to work around that, I'm just going to save this to app.yaml. And then I'm going to do my Docker compose using two static files. And now when I run this, oops, you know what? I forgot to stop the containers from earlier. Okay, I'm just going to kill everything. I made an alias that just kills everything. Maybe. Looks like my local Docker CLI or daemon is a little swamped here. Okay, so I'm going to do something dangerous here, and I'm going to restart Docker. Okay, so we'll give that a minute. But in the meantime, I'll continue on with the slides, and we'll come back to that in just a second. Okay, so one of the other things that we've noticed is that we frequently want to disable services for local development. So like you just saw, I needed to disable the desktop client and then spin up a local dev container for it. But keeping track of all these services, remember Sally had to send me that command and it was super long, and as a developer, man, I don't want to have to remember that every time. And wouldn't it be nice if we could have a tool that generalizes that for us, remembers the settings, and then we can make use of that in each of our projects. So one of the things that we've built is another little project that we've just called DevDoc. And DevDoc, what it does is it uses other extension fields to allow discovery of services that could be disabled. For example, this API service, we add a xdevdoc-description of API and backend. Then we also add another field that says what's the setting that needs to be set false in order to actually disable this. We'll be able to clean that up once one of the open pull requests on the Docker app is actually merged, but as of right now, we still need that. And then the same thing for the desktop client. What this allows me to do is then I can basically build a CLI to say, I want to pull this Docker app. It'll scan all the services and be able to determine what I need. Let me see if my CLI is back. Okay, we'll give that a second. So with this description and this setting, again, we can say, grab this Docker app and it build a local CLI, and we can say, I want to disable this one, and it persists it for the local, on the local machine, so the developer doesn't have to remember what are the settings I need to set, et cetera. And the commands become much smaller. The command line interface for this, we just say dev doc project name just to kind of namespace the settings when we do persistence. And then what's the Docker app image that we're going to tie to? If we don't provide any additional arguments, so it's just these 3 arguments, we get a little CLI, which I'll be able to show you once my Docker engine gets back up. And it presents a CLI that allows me to say, here's all the services that we discovered. What do you want to disable? I want to disable this one. Great. It persists it. It deploys it. Goes from there. If I provide any additional arguments, those get passed to the underlying Docker compose command that we were just constructing ourselves, and it passes those through. So I could do a dev doc DCEU Mike07 DCEU.docker app and do a logs-f, for example. So let's see if I can do that yet. Hooray, it's back up. Okay, so let's actually go back to this real quick and run my test just to prove that I wasn't. Oh, it actually, how did it spin everything back up? Come on. Okay. Clean slate. Okay, I've got no stack, so nothing should be bringing it back up. Let's go. Yeah, so something's on 5900. I'm not even using that port. Okay. I'm going to try one thing. If it doesn't work, we'll just keep moving on. Let me prune all my networks here. Okay. See if there's just some extra metadata hanging around. All right. Well, assume that worked. All right. Okay, so if I do dev doc DCEU Mike07 DCEU.docker app master, what this is going to do is it's going to fetch that and discover those different settings, and I can say, all right, as a desktop, sure, I want to run this with the desktop client disabled. Okay. What I probably should have done, let me share. Okay. Let me spin that back down. So if I run this, let's just go ahead and enable everything. And it's going to now spin up each of those services. And it's using Docker app under the hood. So it's detected that right now I'm in the master branch. So I'm going to use the master image and go from there. And like I mentioned earlier, if I add any other commands, it'll just pass those under to the underlying Docker compose. So logs-f, and now I'm getting all the logs. And one of these screens has a browser in it. And I can spin it up. I didn't actually merge that into master. That's fine. So test. And again, I just spun that up using devdoc. Now, one of the things that's actually most exciting about this is my next slide. Okay. With this devdoc CLI, okay, we can make an alias for this. And I could say, all right, I'm going to alias DCEU to be devdoc DCEU Mike37. And this branch is kind of a template. It's a templated variable you can think of. It's going to detect what branch I'm currently in, and then check out the associated branch. So if my working directory is on the master branch, it's going to use master. If I'm in theme for DockerCon, it's going to use theme for DockerCon. Then what this means is I can run DCEU up. I can do DCEU logs. I can do DCEU down. And I basically have a customized CLI, a command line tool here that's tailor-specific for my project. I don't have to tell all the developers, hey, run all this crazy Docker app stuff. I don't have to tell my developers, remember this dev doc thing. Just add this alias, and everything else will just work from there. Let's actually go ahead and, let's see. So I'll just show that real quick. DCEU, I'll do a config, which will do a Docker compose config. That'll show me, here's what it would render. DCEU up. I'll just run it in the background. Again, this is going to pull master. If I do a DCEU logs, and again, I've got a CLI that's tailor specific for my team. On my team, on our project called Summit, now I can just tell the developers, do a Summit up, and everything works from there. how to install it if you want to play around with it. I know this is a terrible way to distribute a tool like this, but we're using NPM, whatever. And it allows us to iterate, and we can continue to evolve it. If we decide to change it to Golang or something else later, we can do that. But feel free to try it, give it a whirl, and give us some feedback on it. So to recap, Docker Compose is incredible. There's a lot of great features with it that we can use. Docker App's awesome, and it allows us to ship these images around really easily. And using extension fields, we can build tools of our own. To recap, we got some I asked the developers on my team for testimonials, and this is what I got. Those jokesters. Healed my relationship with my wife and kids. That's awesome. But anyways, for real though, I got some great feedback from the developers, and they basically told me that now they have greater assurance that they're using the right components. So back to the original problem, they knew that if I do a sum it up, I'm going to have the right versions of all the different components. I don't have to remember to check out each of the different components, pull the latest images, et cetera. It's just going to work. And their testimonials reflect that as well. So with that, thanks. And I'll just remind everyone to go ahead and fill out the survey afterwards. And if you have questions, do we have time?
We're just about out of time.
Okay.
Maybe you can take one or two, but the rest of you can come by and talk to the speaker after. Any questions that you want the larger audience to hear?
Or if you have any other questions, feel free to come up and just chat with me.
That's right.
Be hanging out in the back. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike.